History teaches that World War I began in 1914, ignited by a single gunshot in Sarajevo. But history, as written, often hides a deeper truth. What if the First World War did not begin with rifles and trenches, but with sails and wooden ships? What if it did not last 4 years, but 283? This is not the story of one nation. It is the story of 7 empires. 7 powers that crossed oceans, erased civilizations, and fought endlessly over a land they called the New World. This is the story of World War Zero. In the year 1492, 3 ships cut through the Atlantic: the Santa Maria, the Nina, the Pinta. To Europe, this was exploration. To the Americas, it was the first invasion. Christopher Columbus did not arrive in an empty land. He arrived in a continent filled with millions of people, advanced societies, and ancient empires. And with his arrival came the first weapon of World War Zero: claim. Spain claimed land it did not own, gold it did not mine, souls it did not save. Within decades, Spanish steel, smallpox, and forced labor collapsed entire civilizations. But Spain was not alone. By the early 1500s, the world's greatest powers realized something terrifying. Whoever controlled the Americas would control the future. Soon, 7 nations entered the war simultaneously, sometimes as allies, often as enemies. Spain, gold, conquest, religious domination. Portugal, trade routes and coastal control. France, fur, alliances with native tribes. England, colonization and permanent settlement. The Netherlands, commerce and naval supremacy. The Holy Roman Empire, indirect influence and finance. Various indigenous confederacies, fighting for survival. This was no longer exploration, this was global warfare. World War Zero had no single front line. Instead, it was fought through forts instead of trenches, muskets instead of machine guns, diseases instead of bombs, religious conversion instead of occupation. Entire tribes vanished not from defeat, but from illness weaponized by contact. Smallpox moved faster than any army. Within 100 years, over 50 million indigenous people were dead. No treaty, no surrender, just silence. By the 1600s, America was no longer a destination, it was a war zone. England and France fought proxy wars using native allies. Spain defended silver routes with brutality. The Dutch seized ports and trade hubs. Pirates, unofficial soldiers, raided empires freely. This was total war before the term existed. Children were born into conflict, died in conflict, forgot what peace meant. As gold ran thin, the war evolved. Now, the greatest weapon was labor. Millions of Africans were captured, sold, and shipped across the Atlantic. The transatlantic slave trade became the fuel of World War Zero. Plantations were factories, slaves were ammunition, profit was victory. Every empire participated, every empire benefited, every empire denied responsibility. By the early 1700s, something unexpected happened. The colonies, born as pawns, began to think. Generations raised in war questioned empire. Why fight for kings across the ocean? Why bleed for crowns they would never wear? Ideas spread faster than armies. Self-rule, liberty, resistance. The war that began as conquest was creating its own enemy. After 283 years, the endless war reached a breaking point. In 1775, colonial militias raised weapons, not against native tribes, not against rival empires, but against their creators. The American Revolution was not the beginning of conflict, it was the final rebellion of World War Zero. The war that started with Columbus ended with revolution, not with peace, but with transformation. World War Zero is not taught in schools because it has no clear villain, no single battlefield, no simple ending. But without it, there is no United States, No global trade system, no modern warfare, no world powers as we know them. The First World War did not begin in 1914. It began the moment the Old World decided the New World was worth dying for and killing for. The greatest war in history was not the loudest, but the longest. By the year 1600, the Americas were no longer a land of discovery. They were a contested prize. European flags flew over stolen soil, but control was fragile. Forts fell, colonies collapsed, entire settlements vanished overnight. Every empire learned the same brutal truth: America could not be ruled easily. Spain held the South with iron cruelty. France stretched across rivers and forests. England clung desperately to the Atlantic coast. The Dutch controlled commerce like silent kings, and between them all stood the indigenous nations, still fighting, still resisting, still surviving. This was not colonization, this was occupation under constant siege. World War II had armies no general could command. Disease marched faster than soldiers. Fear spread faster than fire. Greed outran morality. Smallpox, measles, influenza, these were not accidental outbreaks. They became unintentional weapons, wiping out villages before muskets ever arrived. Entire civilizations disappeared without a battle. In Europe, historians recorded empty lands. In reality, those lands were mass graves. Direct war between empires was expensive, so they fought indirectly. France armed one tribe, England armed another. Spain turned allies into soldiers. The Dutch funded conflicts from the shadows. Indigenous warriors were forced into a war that was never theirs. This was proxy warfare, centuries before the term existed. Victory was no longer measured in land gained, but in who bled the most. When empires could not fight openly, they hired chaos. Pirates, men without nations, flags without loyalty, violence without rules. Pirates attacked Spanish treasure fleets, burned English ports, and crippled trade routes. Some were criminals, others were secretly sponsored by kings. They were mercenaries of World War II, and the Atlantic became a battlefield without laws. By the mid-1600s, gold was no longer enough. Empires needed endless labor, so they turned to Africa. The transatlantic slave trade was not a side effect of colonization. It was a strategic pillar of World War II. Over 12 million Africans were kidnapped, chained, shipped, and sold. Plantations became war factories. Slaves became economic weapons. Profit replaced humanity. This was warfare without uniforms. Faith became another tool of conquest. Missionaries followed soldiers. Conversion followed destruction. Christianity was used to justify land theft, cultural erasure, and forced obedience. Indigenous religions were labeled evil. Resistance was labeled sin. This was ideological warfare, not to destroy bodies, but identities. Despite unimaginable losses, resistance never died. Native confederacies united. Runaway slaves formed free communities. Colonists began whispering rebellion. From the forests to the plantations, resistance spread quietly. The war was changing. The oppressed were learning the language of power. By the early 1700s, Europe was exhausted. Empires were rich but unstable, powerful but overstretched. America was no longer a prize, it was a burden. Colonies demanded protection. Wars demanded money. Taxes crushed citizens. The same war that built empires was now destroying them. Something unexpected emerged from centuries of war. Ideas. Philosophers questioned kings. Writers challenged divine rule. Colonists read forbidden texts. Liberty, representation, self-rule. These ideas spread faster than any disease ever had, and they terrified empires. The descendants of settlers had never seen peace. They were born into conflict, raised by fear, and shaped by war. They knew how to fight, and now they knew who to fight. Not indigenous nations, not rival empires, but the crowns that controlled them. In 1775, After 283 years of uninterrupted conflict, World War II entered its final stage. Shots rang out in Lexington and Concord. But this was not the beginning of war. It was the end of the longest war in human history. A war that began with sails, ended with revolution. The American Revolution was not just independence, it was a transfer of power. Empires weakened, colonies transformed, global influence shifted. World War II had reshaped economics, warfare, politics, and identity itself. Nothing would ever be the same. History books divided World War II into pieces: colonization, slave trade, frontier wars, independence movements. But these were not separate events. They were chapters of one continuous war, a war without a name, until now. Modern warfare did not begin in 1914. It was perfected over 283 years in America. Total war, economic warfare, ideological warfare, proxy warfare. World War II was the blueprint, and we are still living in its aftermath. The longest war in history was not fought with tanks, but with time.